We've talked about Azure virtual machines. We've talked about virtual networks, as well as network security groups. All those are managed in Azure using the ARM, or Azure Resource Manager. ARM is a management layer within Azure that handles all the deployments, updates, and deletes of Azure resources. Any of the ways that we interact with Azure, whether it's through the Azure portal, Azure CLI, Azure PowerShell, or even the REST APIs, is all interfacing with the ARM management layer. With that said, one of the ways that we can simplify the management of our resources is by leveraging ARM templates. ARM templates are code that define a resource. In this instance, you can see we are managing a storage account, and we can tell that by looking at the type. You can see it says Microsoft.storage/storage account. It also has all of the attributes that Azure needs to know about in order to create that resource or manage that resource. We've got the type, the location, as well as the SKU. What this does is it opens up the opportunity to leverage the infrastructure as code methodologies so that we can define all of our resources using code. So this way it's easy to recreate and redeploy those as we need to down the line. We can download the templates from the Azure portal after the resource is created, and we'll show that in the demo here. Additionally, we can author new templates from scratch, or Microsoft has done a great job of providing a number of quick start templates that give us a building block that we can take those, and if they work for what we're after, great. If not, we can easily edit those so that we can get what we need. Now that we understand the principle of ARM templates, let's take a look at the file types. The basis of ARM templates is the ARM template file, and this is going to contain all of the information. If we look at our past example, everything was defined within that ARM template. This works great for simple deployments. If we needed to create multiple storage accounts rather than have to create multiple different template files, one thing we can do that might simplify it and also standardize it is to create one template file and have that pull information from the parameter file. In that parameter file, we would define the name of the storage account, the location, the SKU, and then any potential tags or any other properties that we needed to define. Once we have the parameter file and the template file, this gives us the ability to create modular deployments so that we can take both of those, make sure we're standardizing our deployments because they're all using the same template file, but each unique deployment or each unique resource gets its own parameter file. Once we have everything together, we can create deployment scripts. And instead of having to go through and manually execute each template and parameter file, we could have a deployment script go through and gather everything and deploy it all at the same time. Now let's take a little bit closer look at the template files themselves. Within each template file, you can define parameters. And a parameter is something that, again, you can pull from a parameter file or you can enter them at runtime. But essentially, these allow you to pass arguments into the ARM template. A perfect example of this would be the storage account name and the location. Within the template file, though, you can take that and define variables. And a variable is something that is essentially calculated at runtime. An example of this would be, instead of having to determine or define the location for each resource, you could create a variable that says, I'm going to look at the location of the resource group I'm deploying to, and I want the resource to be defined in that same location. This way, instead of having to enter that parameter in every time, you create a variable that allows it to be dynamically determined at runtime. Resources. This is the actual resource that's going to be created by the ARM template. You can have multiple resources in a single template, or you can have one resource, but every ARM template will have a resource that it's defining. And then finally, the outputs. For example, if we're creating our storage account, one of the outputs that we can have is the resource ID of our new storage account. Once an ARM template is done running, we can output one or more values. This can help let us know how to access the resources that were created via an IP address or the resource ID. Additionally, you can pass the output to another ARM template. For example, if you create a Vnet and a subnet in one template, you can then pass the resource ID of the subnet to another template that will create and associate an NSG with that subnet. So with that said, let's create a Vnet using ARM templates. In order to do that, we're going to need to define some properties. For the Vnet, we're going to need to give it a name. In this case, we're going to call it example Vnet. We also need to give it an address space. So with this, we're going to give it a 10.10 address space borrowing 16 bits. Once we have the Vnet set up, as we learned, we can't really do anything with the Vnet itself, so we need to create a subnet within that Vnet. We're going to create a subnet called example subnet 01, and we're going to give it an address space of 1010/24. To do all of this, we're going to create two files. We're going to have the ARM Vnet file, and this is going to be the template file. So it's going to have all of the constructs essentially for creating the Vnets and the subnets in there, but we're also going to pass it a parameters file. And that parameters file is going to have the specifics, namely the Vnet name, the address space, as well as the subnet name and the subnet prefix. Now that we've talked about this, let's go into the portal and let's demonstrate it. Here we are back in the Azure portal. We've got our Skylines resource group opened up. We've got our existing resources that we've been working with, the Skylines Vnet, the Skylines VM, so on and so forth. What we're going to do today is we're going to deploy a new Vnet using an ARM template. So in order to do that, let's take a look at the ARM templates that we have ready to go. So we're going to open up VS Code here, and we've got our handful of files. We're going to go ahead and open up the templates file. And if we scroll up a little bit here, you can see we've got our parameters. And I'm going to go ahead and collapse the parameters, the variables, resources, and outputs. Looking at this for the AZ-204 exam, Microsoft doesn't want you to be able to write a ARM template from scratch. However, they're going to be able to want you to look at an existing ARM template and understand what's going on and understand what resources are going to be created. So keep that in mind as we're walking through this. One thing I haven't mentioned yet is that all of the ARM templates are written in JSON. If you're not familiar with JSON, it's really easy to follow. It is, as some would consider, very verbose. The biggest thing to note is that everything is defined within a starting and ending bracket. So if we look at parameters here, we've got Vnet name, address prefix, subnet name, and subnet prefix. Additionally, it tells you the type of value that's expected with that parameter. All these are strings, and additionally gives you a description, which you can use to describe what that parameter is defining. We don't have any default values defined here, but if there was a default value from a parameter, you would see that below that parameter name. Scrolling down a little bit and taking a look at the variables, you can see we've got one variable here defined called location, and it's taking a look at the resource group that we're deploying to, determining the location of that, and setting that value or setting the output of that as the value for the location variable. So again, we're not defining anything per se, but at runtime it's going to take some information and create a value or determine a value based upon something else. Dropping down into our resources, we can see here we've got a type of Microsoft.network/virtual networks. Again, the big thing is to be able to look at that type and understand what's being created. It usually is pretty verbose, and you're able to look at that and figure out what's going on pretty quickly. Dropping down a little bit to the name, you can see we're taking the value of the Vnet parameter, and we're going to define that as the name of the virtual network. For the location now, we're taking that location variable, and the value of that we're going to use as the location for this virtual network. Scrolling down some, if we take a look at the parameters of the address prefix, you can see that's what we're defining for that Vnet address prefix. Going down a little further, again, same, we're using that subnet name parameter for the name of the subnet, and the subnet prefix for the address prefix of that subnet. As you look through this, you can see we're not doing anything terribly complex with this. You just need to be able to look at this and understand or break it down step by step to see what's going on. And then finally, scrolling down to the outputs, this is what's going to be presented when the ARM template completes. And you can see here we're getting the resource ID for the subnet as well as the Vnet. Moving over to the templates file, again, you can see it is in a JSON format. This one's much more concise. We essentially have one parameter block, and underneath that parameter block, we've got the Vnet name, address prefix, so on and so forth. So essentially, we've got all of our parameter names, and then we've got the value for those parameters. So if we take all this and we look at our deployment file here, this is essentially a PowerShell commandlet new AZ resource group deployment, and it's going to take, or we're going to give it a name of Vnet demo. We're going to tell it that it's going to deploy to the Skylines resource group, and then we're going to give it our template file, and then we're going to give it our parameter file. And when this runs, it's basically going to take all those parameters, it's going to pass it into the template file, and then it's going to create whatever resource is defined. So let's go ahead and see it in action. I'm going to copy this, and then we're going to go over to our PowerShell console here, and you can see that I'm already signed in to the Azure portal, or my Azure account here. And I'm going to go ahead and paste this in, and we're going to run it. Give it a couple seconds here. And you can see that it went ahead and deployed. It's successful. And additionally, we can look at the parameters. You can see the parameter names that we passed in, as well as the values that we passed in associated with each parameter. And then at the output, we can see we've got the resource ID of both the subnet as well as the VNet. If we go back to the Azure portal now and do a refresh, we can see our new VNets deployed. If we go ahead and open that up, you can see again, we've got the address space we defined, we've got the location of that variable value, and we've got our subnets defined with the appropriate address prefix. Now, one of the things we talked about briefly in the PowerPoints is how do we take an existing resource in Azure and create an ARM template based upon that. The vast majority of resources in Azure, if we scroll down under settings, we have this option for export template. If we select that, we can see that Microsoft has a ARM template output here that we can take and we can download. It's not going to be the same ARM template that we used to create it. However, it is something that if we take that ARM template, we ran it again, it would create this resource exactly like it was. This is really handy for one-to-one options, or basically if you're looking to recreate your environment from scratch. However, if we look at this and taking our knowledge of ARM templates, we can see we've only got one parameter value defined here. We're just defining the VNet name. And if we scroll down, we can see it's already hard-coded the address space, as well as hard-coded the subnet name, as well as the subnet prefixes. This, again, would work just fine if we're doing the one-to-one replacement. However, if we wanted to take this and potentially modularize it or create more than one VNet using this ARM template, you can see we're going to have to edit that template itself. It's better, in my opinion, if you're going to do something like this, to look at it, add some parameters like we did in our template demo, so that this way they're more reusable and more flexible. Additionally, we talked about how Azure has a number of quick start templates. So if we do a quick search here for Azure ARM Quick Start, and we open up this first link here, you can see Azure has a number of resources that are already out there, a number of examples of ARM templates. So let's go ahead and look at this VM Linux Create one. And you can see we've got a parameter file as well as a template file. So let's go ahead and open this one up. If we scroll through it real quick, again, we can see we've got our parameters up here with the number defined. We've got our variable files here, or excuse me, our variables here. And then we've got our resources. And what Microsoft would like you to be able to do is take a look at this file and kind of get an idea of what's going on. With that in mind, we can look at this and see that, okay, we're creating a storage account here. And basically it's getting the name, or its name is coming from the variable storage account name. Here we're creating a network security group, and it's using the variable network security group for the name. Here we're creating a virtual network. Again, they're not looking to have you write these from scratch, but you need to be able to look at an existing template and understand what's going on. With that in mind, I do recommend you do one or two deployments of this, create an ARM template, or use one of the quick start template that's available. Add some of your own variables, deploy it once or twice just to get some familiarity with it. It'll become immensely helpful, not only for taking the 204 exam, but also as you develop or continue your journey in Azure. ARM templates really are extremely valuable, and ARM is something that you do need to understand, or at least have a concept of, because it really is the underlying structure of the Azure environment.